We are living through a moment in history that future generations will look back upon as the great unraveling. For decades, the collective consciousness of the West has been lulled into a comatose state of security, fed by the illusion that technological superiority guarantees eternal dominance. But as I have warned you repeatedly, the architecture of American hegemony is not built on stone, it is built on silicon, on data streams, and on a fragile web of satellites that circle our planet like a crown of thorns. Today, we are looking at the scenario that strips that crown away. The recent frantic leaks from Washington regarding a Russian space-based nuclear weapon designed to trigger an electromagnetic pulse, or EMP, is not just another news cycle. It is the realization of the ultimate nightmare for the Atlanticist establishment. It is the moment the Roman Empire realizes the barbarians do not need to scale the walls. They only need to poison the aqueducts. To understand the gravity of this, you must first strip away the Hollywood veneer of explosions and fireballs. The threat facing the United States and its European vassals is not a nuclear winter of the traditional sort. It is a silent execution of the modern world. Imagine, for a moment, a single detonation in low Earth orbit. There is no blast wave that knocks down buildings. There is no mushroom cloud over New York or London. Instead, there is a flood of gamma rays creating a massive electromagnetic surge that hits the atmosphere and rains down electrons. In a nanosecond, the lights go out. But it is not just the lights. The banking system, which exists purely as digital ones and zeros, evaporates. The logistics chains that deliver food to supermarkets, orchestrated by GPS and automated inventory systems, freeze. Water pumping stations stop. Hospitals go dark. The United States, the self-proclaimed master of the universe, is sent back to the mid-19th century in the blink of an eye. But with a population of 330 million people who have absolutely no idea how to survive in the 19th century. This creates a paradox that the Pentagon has long feared but refused to publicly acknowledge. The more advanced a society becomes, the more fragile it becomes. A peasant farmer in the global south, relying on local crops and analog tools, will barely notice the event. The Wall Street broker, the Silicon Valley engineer, and the drone operator in Nevada will find their entire existence erased. This is the asymmetric equalizer. This is why the establishment is panicking. It is not because Russia is threatening to destroy the world. It is because Russia has reportedly developed a checkmate move that neutralizes the trillion-dollar conventional military advantage of the United States without firing a single shot on the ground. We must contextualize this within the grand sweep of history and the hypocrisy of the American empire. Washington creates a narrative where space is a sanctuary, a neutral commons for the benefit of mankind. This is a lie. Since the dawn of the Cold War, the United States has viewed space exactly as it viewed Latin America under the Monroe Doctrine, as its exclusive backyard, a domain to be dominated and militarized to enforce its will on the surface below. The entire modern American way of warfare, precision airstrikes, drone assassinations, global surveillance, carrier strike group coordination is entirely dependent on space-based assets. Without satellites, the U.S. military is deaf, dumb, and blind. They become a giant with a club, flailing in the dark. When we look at the history of the space race, it was never about exploration, it was about the high ground. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967 was signed not out of benevolence, but out of fear. Both the Soviets and the Americans knew that weaponizing orbit was a suicide pact. However, in the post-Soviet era, during the unipolar moment when America felt it had no peer competitor, the arrogance of the establishment grew unchecked. The United States withdrew from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. They withdrew from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. They pushed the boundaries of weaponizing space with the Space Force and dual-use technologies, assuming Russia and China would remain dormant, technologically inferior powers forever. They were wrong. This development serves as a harsh lesson in the consequences of systemic hypocrisy. You cannot surround a nuclear superpower like Russia with NATO bases, finance proxy wars on its border, attempt to strangle its economy with sanctions, and then act surprised when that power develops a weapon of last resort to guarantee its survival. The West operates under the delusion that it can dictate the rules of engagement, that it can wage economic and proxy warfare without suffering existential retaliation. This EMP capability shatters that delusion. It sends a clear message: if you threaten the existence of the Russian state, the mechanism of your own power, your grid, your satellites, your digital economy can be switched off. This is the classic Thucydides trap, but with a technological twist. The ruling power, the United States, sees its dominance eroding. It sees the rise of a multipolar order where the global south, led by the BRICS nations, is no longer afraid of American financial coercion. In response, the US relies on military intimidation. But what happens when the rival power develops a shield that renders that intimidation obsolete? The panic we are seeing in the Western intelligence community is not concern for human life. If they cared about human life, they would not have turned the Middle East into a graveyard over the last 20 years. No, the panic is born from the realization that their monopoly on violence is ending. The narrative being spun by Western media right now is predictable. They paint this as an act of unprovoked aggression, a madman's plot to plunge the world into darkness. They conveniently omit the decades of provocation that brought us here. They omit the fact that the United States has plans for prompt global strike, the ability to hit any target on Earth with conventional weapons in under an hour, a capability that destabilizes the nuclear balance just as much as an orbital nuke. They omit the reality that the US dollar's weaponization has forced sovereign nations to seek insurance policies, and there is no greater insurance policy than the ability to say, if we go down, the lights in Washington go out forever. As we move deeper into this analysis, we have to look at the specific mechanism of power that is failing here. The United States has long relied on two pillars: the dollar and the military. Both rely on faith and connectivity. The EMP threat targets the connectivity. It exposes the reality that Western civilization is a glass house, and for too long, its leaders have been throwing stones. The historical precedent here is stark. Just as the invention of the cannon rendered the stone castles of feudal Europe obsolete, forcing a complete restructuring of political power, this capability renders the castle of American technological supremacy obsolete. We are witnessing the twilight of the empire, not because it lacks ships or planes, but because it lacks the strategic wisdom to understand that in a connected world, total war is a suicide pact. The hubris of the neoconservatives in Washington led them to believe they could manage the decline of Russia and the containment of China simultaneously. Instead, they have accelerated the development of asymmetric counters that threaten the very foundation of Western modernity, and this foundation is not merely built on ideology, but on a specific coercive mechanism that has allowed the United States to extract wealth from the rest of the world for 80 years. The weaponization of the global financial system. To truly understand the panic in Washington regarding this orbital threat, you must look beyond the generals and look at the bankers. The true source of American power is not the aircraft carrier, it is the SWIFT system. It is the ability to strangle a nation's economy by cutting it off from the US dollar, which serves as the global reserve currency. This is the exorbitant privilege that allows the US to run massive deficits, funding its military machine with money it prints out of thin air, while the rest of the world works to produce actual goods in exchange for this depreciating paper. However, an electromagnetic pulse weapon in orbit is the ultimate negation of this financial hegemony. The modern banking system is nothing more than a digital ledger, a record of debts and credits stored on servers. If those servers are fried, if the digital infrastructure is wiped out, the debt is wiped out. The leverage is wiped out. The digital leash that Washington wraps around the neck of every sovereign nation dissolves instantly. The nightmare scenario for the establishment is not just a dark continent. It is a debt jubilee where the creditor class, the masters of the universe on Wall Street, suddenly finds that their trillions of dollars in derivatives and assets have simply ceased to exist. The EMP is the great equalizer that resets the global scoreboard to zero, erasing decades of financial accumulation that was achieved not through production, but through usury and financial engineering. But we do not need to wait for a nuclear detonation in space to see that this system is already failing. The panic regarding the space weapon is actually a symptom of a much deeper anxiety: the failure of the sanctions regime. When the conflict in Ukraine escalated, the United States and its European vassals unleashed what they called the financial nuclear option. They seized Russian sovereign assets, they disconnected Russian banks from SWIFT, and they imposed thousands of sanctions designed to crush the ruble and induce regime change in Moscow. The arrogant assumption in Washington, born of the same hubris we discussed earlier, was that Russia was merely a gas station with atomic weapons and that it would collapse within weeks. Instead, the opposite happened. And this is the critical point that the Western media refuses to analyze honestly. The Russian economy did not collapse. It adapted, it pivoted, and in doing so, it exposed the hollow nature of Western economic power. We discovered that you cannot sanction a country that produces the food, the fertilizer, the energy, and the raw materials that the world actually needs. You can print dollars, but you cannot print gas. You cannot print wheat. You cannot print palladium. The United States discovered that its services-based economy, an economy of apps, consulting firms, and financial speculation, is useless in a war of attrition against a real industrial power. This failure of the sanctions mechanism has accelerated the very thing the U.S. has spent decades trying to prevent: the creation of a parallel global system. We are watching the circumvention of the empire in real time. Russia, China, Iran, and the broader global south are building a new financial architecture that bypasses New York and London entirely. They are trading in local currencies. They are developing the CIPS payment system to replace SWIFT. They are effectively de-dollarizing the global energy trade. The petrodollar, the arrangement where oil is sold exclusively in US dollars, forcing every nation to hold dollars, is dying. When Saudi Arabia discusses selling oil to China in yuan, or when India buys Russian oil in rupees and dirhams, they are driving a stake through the heart of American hegemony. The EMP threat must be viewed through this lens. It is the ultimate insurance policy for this new emerging order. The United States has proven that it is willing to steal the sovereign reserves of any nation that disagrees with its foreign policy. They did it to Afghanistan, they did it to Venezuela, and they did it to Russia. This weaponization of trust has backfired spectacularly. It has told the rest of the world that the US dollar is not a safe haven, it is a trap. It is a political weapon. Consequently, the global south is moving its assets out of the Western jurisdiction. They are buying gold at record rates. They are repatriating their wealth. They are building a shadow fleet of tankers to move oil without Western insurance or shipping cartels. So, when the intelligence agencies in Washington scream about a space-based weapon, they are screaming because they realize they have lost control of the escalation ladder. For decades, the US strategy has been to squeeze nations economically until they submit. If they don't submit, the US bombs them. But you cannot economically squeeze a nation that has successfully circumvented your financial system, and you cannot bomb a nation that has the ability to turn off your own lights and erase your own economy with a single orbital strike. The stick of American foreign policy has been broken. The sanctions button has been pushed, and nothing happened. The military threat is being neutralized by asymmetric deterrence. This leads to a palpable sense of dread within the Beltway. They are witnessing the system failure of the unipolar model. They are realizing that the world is too big, too complex, and too tired of American hypocrisy to be bullied any longer. The resistance is not just coming from Moscow or Beijing. It is structural. It is the inevitable result of overusing coercion. Every time the U.S. uses the dollar as a weapon, it incentivizes the creation of an alternative. Every time they use the SWIFT system to punish dissent, they speed up the adoption of blockchain and alternative ledgers. They have created their own gravediggers. The target nation, in this case, Russia, has demonstrated a resilience that the West cannot comprehend because the West has lost its own resilience. Western societies are fragile. They are dependent on just in time supply chains, cheap consumer goods, and endless debt. A disruption of a few days causes chaos in Western capitals. In contrast, nations like Russia and Iran, which have been under siege for years or decades, have built resistance economies. They have localized production. They have hardened their infrastructure. They have prepared their populations psychologically for conflict. This creates a disparity in will. The West wants to maintain its hegemony comfortably. The East is fighting for its existential survival. And in history, the power fighting for survival always endures more pain and shows more ingenuity than the power fighting for luxury. Washington is now trapped in a maze of its own making. The tools of empire are blunted. The media narrative, which we will discuss later, is failing to convince the global South. The economic coercion is accelerating the rise of BRICS. And now the military option is being checked by the ultimate asymmetric threat. They are realizing that if they push too hard, if they cross the red lines regarding existential threats to Russia, the response will not be a tank battle in Poland that NATO can simulate and war game. The response will be the invisible strike. It will be the sudden, silent death of the electronic grid that sustains the American way of life. They are playing poker with a player who has looked at their cards, seen that they are bluffing, and has put a loaded gun on the table. The era of consequence-free interventionism is over, and the panic you see in the headlines is the realization that the bill for decades of imperial hubris is finally coming due. But the failure of the American empire is not merely a matter of economics or military logistics. It is at its core a catastrophic moral failure. To understand why the world is cheering for the decline of US hegemony and why the global South is quietly siding with Russia and China, we must dismantle the greatest propaganda construct of the last century, the myth of American benevolence. For decades, Washington has cloaked its naked imperial ambition in the language of democracy, human rights, and the rules-based international order. These are not principles. They are marketing slogans used to sell wars of aggression to a domestic population that is too distracted to ask questions. But to the rest of the world, to the nations that have been on the receiving end of this freedom, the mask has fallen off. They see the United States not as a global policeman, but as a global arsonist, a power that sets fire to entire regions and then demands payment to put out the flames. We are now trapped in a moral trap of Washington's own design. The establishment argues that we must oppose Russia to save democracy or protect sovereignty. This argument collapses the moment you look at the track record of the last 20 years. Let us be brutally honest about the legacy of American interventionism. It is a legacy of ash and ruin. There is not a single nation that the United States has intervened in over the last 2 decades that is better off today than it was before the US arrived. Not one. This is not an accident. It is a feature of the system. The goal was never stability. The goal was fragmentation. The destruction of strong sovereign states that could say no to American corporate interests and the installation of pliable puppet regimes that would hand over the keys to the national treasury. Look at Iraq. We must never stop talking about Iraq because it is the original sin of the 21st century. The United States, based on intelligence they knew was fabricated, invaded a sovereign nation, dismantled its state apparatus, and unleashed a sectarian bloodbath that killed over 1 million people. And for what? To secure oil contracts? To encircle Iran? To project power? The result was the creation of a vacuum that gave birth to ISIS. The United States destroyed a secular functioning society, albeit a dictatorship, and replaced it with a chaotic, failed state. When the Russian strategists look at Iraq, they do not see a mistake. They see a promise. They see what Washington does to nations that cannot defend themselves. Look at Libya. This is perhaps the most cynical case study of all. Muammar Gaddafi was not overthrown because of human rights abuses. If human rights were the metric, half of Washington's allies in the Gulf would be on the target list. Gaddafi was overthrown because he planned to create a gold-backed African dinar to replace the CFA franc and the US dollar for oil trade. He threatened the financial mechanism we discussed in the previous section. So, under the guise of responsibility to protect, NATO turned the most prosperous nation in Africa, a nation with free healthcare and education, into a dystopian wasteland where human beings are literally sold in open slave markets today. Hillary Clinton laughed about it on live television. We came, we saw, he died. That laugh echoed around the world. It told every leader in the global south that there is no mercy, no law, and no morality in Washington, only raw power. Look at Syria. The United States spent years arming and funding moderate rebels who turned out to be extremists and affiliates of Al Qaeda in an attempt to topple the Syrian government. They prolonged a civil war that destroyed the country, displaced millions, and created a refugee crisis that nearly broke Europe. They currently occupy the oil-rich regions of Syria, stealing the oil of a starving nation. This is the reality of the rules-based order. It is an order where the U.S. can illegally occupy territory, steal resources, and sanction the victim for complaining. This history of destruction creates the moral trap that makes the current crisis with Russia insoluble through diplomacy. Why would Russia trust a treaty signed by Washington? They saw what happened to Gaddafi when he gave up his nuclear program in 2003 to appease the West. He was murdered in the streets 8 years later. They saw what happened when the U.S. pulled out of the JCPOA with Iran, a deal that was working. The lesson the world has learned from American foreign policy is crystal clear. Agreements are worthless. International law is a fiction, applied only to the weak. The only thing that guarantees your survival is the capacity for absolute violence. This directly connects to the EMP threat. The development of a space-based doomsday weapon is the logical conclusion of this breakdown in trust. If you strip away the moral legitimacy of the global system, if you prove that might makes right, then you compel your adversaries to find the ultimate might. Russia knows it cannot trust Western assurances that NATO is a defensive alliance, because they saw NATO destroy Libya. They know they cannot trust economic integration, because they saw their assets seized. So they have retreated to the ultimate realist position, mutually assured destruction, updated for the digital age. The EMP is not an act of aggression in a vacuum. It is a response to the aggression of the democracy promotion industry that has left a trail of corpses from Tripoli to Kabul. The tragedy here is that the American people are also victims of this moral fraud. They are told their tax dollars are buying security and freedom. In reality, they are buying hatred. They are funding a military-industrial complex that requires constant war to justify its budget. The war on terror did not end terror. It globalized it. The promotion of democracy did not spread freedom. It spread instability. And now, this policy of eternal coercion has backed a nuclear superpower into a corner. When you treat a great power the way you treated Iraq or Libya, you do not get a regime change, you get a nuclear standoff. The establishment is now trying to rally the world against Russia's dangerous space weapon using moral language. They scream about the sanctity of space and the risk to civilization, but the global south is not listening. They remember the depleted uranium shells the U.S. used in Iraq. They remember the cluster bombs. They remember the drone strikes on weddings. The moral capital of the West is bankrupt. The emperor has no clothes, and he is standing in a glass house throwing stones at a neighbor who has just invented a slingshot that can shatter the entire structure. We must recognize that the chaos we see escalating today is the direct blowback of this hubris. You cannot sow the wind for 30 years without eventually reaping the whirlwind. The U.S. establishment thought they could break nations without consequence. They thought they could rewrite the map of the Middle East and Eastern Europe to suit their geopolitical whims. But now, the moral trap has snapped shut. They have no credibility to de escalate, no moral high ground to rally a coalition, and no diplomatic channels that haven't been poisoned by their own duplicity. They are left with nothing but threats, and as the space weapon demonstrates, threats are becoming a very dangerous currency to trade in. The world is fragmented, cynical, and armed to the teeth, and the architects of this nightmare reside in Washington, D.C., wondering why their calls for unity are being met with silence or worse, with the hum of a weapon orbiting overhead, ready to switch off the lights on the American century. And this leads us inevitably to the global reckoning, a moment where the tectonic plates of geopolitics are shifting with such violence that the old maps no longer apply. We are witnessing the birth of a new era of asymmetric warfare, where the logic of power has been inverted. For the last century, Western military doctrine was based on overmatch, having more ships, more planes, and more money than the enemy. But the EMP scenario demonstrates that in a highly complex, interconnected world, the expensive, high-tech giant is actually the most vulnerable target on the battlefield. It is the lesson of David and Goliath, rewritten with nuclear physics. The United States has built a military machine designed to fight a conventional war that no one else intends to fight. While the Pentagon was building $13 billion aircraft carriers that can be sunk by hypersonic missiles and relying on a satellite architecture that can be wiped out by a single orbital detonation, its adversaries were studying the pressure points of the system. This is the essence of the gray zone conflict we are now deeply entrenched in. It is not open war, but it is not peace. It is a state of constant reciprocal escalation where the weapons are not just kinetic, but economic, diplomatic, and digital. And in this arena, the United States is finding itself dangerously isolated. The establishment in Washington expected that by threatening Russia, they would rally the world to their side. Instead, they have accelerated the consolidation of the Eurasian bloc. China is watching this drama with intense interest. Beijing understands that the EMP capability is not just a Russian shield, it is a shield for the entire rising multipolar order. It creates a stalemate that prevents the US from using its military dominance to dictate terms to the global south. We must speak plainly about the dragon in the room. The strategic nightmare for the United States was always an alliance between Russian resources and Chinese industry. Thanks to the reckless foreign policy of the Biden administration and the neoconservative establishment, that nightmare is now a reality. China knows it is next on the target list. They have seen the trade wars, the rhetoric about Taiwan, and the attempts to encircle them in the Pacific. Consequently, China is mobilizing diplomatically to support Russia, not necessarily out of love for Moscow, but out of self-preservation. If the U.S. attempts to escalate this crisis regarding the space weapon, China has the economic levers to cripple the West without firing a shot. They control the supply chains for pharmaceuticals, for rare earth minerals essential to modern electronics, and for the green energy transition the West is so obsessed with. This is the reciprocal escalation that the media ignores. If Washington tries to blockade Russia or shoot down satellites, the response will not just be military, it will be economic carnage. Imagine a scenario where China restricts the export of processed rare earths in solidarity with Russia. The U.S. defense industry grinds to a halt. The production of electric vehicles stops. The high-tech economy flatlines. This is the asymmetry of the modern world. The West relies on the East for the physical stuff of life, while the West provides only financial services and intellectual property, both of which are worthless in a survival scenario. The global South, from Brazil to South Africa to Saudi Arabia, sees this dynamic clearly. They are refusing to join the hysterical condemnation of Russia because they know that the era of Western dictation is over. They are hedging their bets, moving toward the BRICS alliance, and insulating themselves from the falling debris of the American empire. This geopolitical abstraction translates into a terrifying reality for the average citizen in the West, and this is the warning that must be heard loud and clear. The stability of your life, the value of your currency, the availability of goods on the shelves, the reliability of your electricity is hanging by a thread. The inflation we have seen over the last few years is just the tremor before the earthquake. If this asymmetric warfare goes hot, if the invisible strike is triggered, or even if the economic war escalates to total decoupling, the standard of living in the West will collapse. We are talking about hyperinflation not as a theory, but as a certainty. When the dollar loses its status as the weapon of choice, those dollars come flooding back home, destroying the purchasing power of the American middle class. The national security state has failed you. They have spent trillions on weapons systems that enrich defense contractors but leave the nation vulnerable to a single point of failure in space. They have picked fights with nuclear superpowers while outsourcing the nation's industrial base to potential adversaries. They have created a world where a conflict in Eastern Europe can empty your bank account and shut off your heat. This is the definition of strategic incompetence. The adults in the room, as they like to call themselves, have gambled the prosperity of the entire Western world on a bluff. The bluff that they could bully the rest of the world forever without pushback. As we look at the diplomatic mobilization of the global South, we see a rejection of this incompetence. Nations are scrambling to join the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. They are building new trade routes, like the North-South Transport Corridor, that completely bypass Europe. They are creating a world island of commerce that excludes the Atlantic powers. This is the great separation. The West is building walls, sanctions, tariffs, visa bans, while the rest of the world is building bridges. And historically, the powers that build walls are the powers that are in decline. They are trying to keep the reality out, to preserve the illusion of control within their garden, while the jungle grows back around them. The ultimate danger in this phase of the crisis is the disconnect between the perception of the elites and the reality on the ground. The elites in Washington, London, and Brussels still believe they can manage this escalation. They believe they can calibrate the pain they inflict on Russia. But war, especially asymmetric war, follows its own chaotic logic. When you back a nation like Russia into a corner, when you threaten their existence with NATO expansion, and then you panic when they put a gun to the head of your satellite network, you are no longer in control. You are a passenger in a vehicle careening off a cliff. The global South is watching this car crash in slow motion, and they are not rushing to help. They are rushing to get out of the way. The international community that the West loves to invoke is a myth. It is just the G7 and a few client states. The real international community, the global majority, is waiting for the dust to settle so they can build a world where they are no longer held hostage by the whims of a dying empire. We have arrived at the final crossroads, the moment where history demands an answer from the fading hegemon. We are witnessing the absolute twilight of the American empire, and the darkness is falling faster than anyone in Washington is willing to admit. The existence of this Russian orbital capability is not merely a technical challenge, it is a metaphysical shock to the American psyche. For 80 years, the United States has operated on the assumption of invulnerability, the belief that it was the indispensable nation chosen by Providence to lead the world. That myth is now dead. It died in the mountains of Afghanistan, it died in the rubble of Bakhmut, and it is being buried by the silent orbiting threat that reminds us all no empire rules forever. The choice facing the United States today is the same choice that faced the British in 1956 during the Suez Crisis, the same choice that faced Rome in its final years. It is a choice between humility and humiliation. The path of humility requires the U.S. establishment to accept that the unipolar moment is over. It requires them to look at Russia and China not as subordinates to be lectured, but as peers to be negotiated with. It requires a retreat from the fantasy of global dominance and a return to the reality of national interest. It means dismantling the hundreds of military bases that encircle the globe, ending the weaponization of the dollar, and accepting a seat at the table of a multipolar world rather than demanding to sit at the head of it. But history teaches us that dying empires rarely choose humility. They almost always choose the path of pride. of doubling down on the failed strategies of coercion and violence until the system snaps. The panic over the EMP weapons suggested Washington is preparing to choose the path of illusion. They cannot conceive of a world where their writ does not run, so they will risk everything, including the very technological foundations of modern civilization, to preserve a ghost. They are willing to gamble the grid, the economy, and the future of their own citizens to maintain the appearance of control. This is the tragedy of the arrogance of power that Senator Fulbright warned about half a century ago. The world is watching. The global south, the BRICS nations, and the rising powers of Eurasia have already made their choice. They have chosen sovereignty. They have chosen to build a future that is not mortgaged to Wall Street or dictated by the Pentagon. The invisible strike that hangs over our heads is simply the guarantee that this new future will be born one way or another. If the West refuses to accommodate this shift peacefully, the mechanism for a hard reset is already in place. The lights may go out in the West, but the sun will still rise in the East. We must shed our illusions. The end of history was a lie. History has returned with a vengeance, and it is armed with nuclear fire and orbital physics. The era of exceptionalism is over. We are now just another nation among nations, subject to the same laws of gravity and the same consequences of hubris as every empire that came before us. The question is no longer whether the American empire will fall. The question is whether it will drag the rest of the world down with it in a final spasmodic act of denial. If you want to understand the forces that are truly shaping your future beyond the propaganda and the lies of the mainstream narrative, you need to be here. This channel is dedicated to the cold, hard reality of geopolitics. We do not offer comfort. We offer the truth. Subscribe now and turn on notifications, because when the shift happens, you need to be prepared, not surprised. I leave you with two questions to debate in the comments below. First, is the United States establishment capable of accepting a multipolar world peacefully, or is war inevitable to preserve their hegemony? And second, if the EMP scenario were to unfold tomorrow, do you believe Western society has the resilience to survive the collapse of its digital infrastructure, or have we become too fragile to endure history? I will be reading your answers